For the second banner cycle of 5.0, we have the rerun of Raiden Shogun, a fan favorite character, being rerun for her fourth time 3 years after her initial release. Well, the game has changed a lot since then. What hasn't changed is Raiden's kit. She still has her iconic burst, dealing large bursts of damage on its initial cast, followed by an electro infusion on her sword, allowing her to generate energy for her team, while being an on-field driver doing moderate damage. This happening alongside her skill applying electro damage and an AoE as a coordinated attack after hits, as well as providing damage percent bonus to teammates based on energy consumed on bursts. These two aspects of her kit have allowed her to maintain relevance in the game so long after release, allowing her to be played in a plethora of different teams where she's run as an on-field driver, taking advantage of her powerful bursts, and even being used as a Dendro enabler using her elemental skill on the side. I would like to dive deeper in her value when she's played as a driver for her teams. In these team comps, she can be played as a large variety of units, ranging from her more iconic teams that she was playing back in the original release, being Raiden Hyper, Raiden National, to new teams have evolved over the times that she released, whether that be Aggravate or in a double Hydro Core or with Chevreuse. All these teams, except for one being the Hyper Raiden, have one thing in common, which is they all rely on the impact of the supports around her to help amplify the team's overall damage. Raiden does do good personal damage, but she's generally not considered a hyper character unless you're willing to put the whale investment into her to get C2 or C3, her engulfing lightning, her signature weapon. Generally, I would not recommend playing her in that hyper team for that specific reason unless you want to put the investment in to get that, but even if you don't, it's still viable. But the rest of these teams, she is a significant portion of the team's damage because all relying on the damage of her supports, which some could see this as a negative that she doesn't have the damage to single-handedly solo carry your teams, but she's not designed to be the solo carrier of your teams. Her main role is she provides damage boost for her teams around her by providing them extra ultimate damage. She provides energy for all our teams to keep energy costs low. She provides a way to regenerate energy while being on field doing DPS without having to stop and do Bennett E's or do any weird particle shenanigans and having to bother catching particles, making them all super easy to use and versatile and flexible, and let you use these teams in almost any combination on any floor where you're going to pick the team for Raiden that is most convenient for your chamber and not most convenient for Raiden. This is not to mention just how free-to-play friendly so many of her teams are. She wants to use a lot of very powerful 4-stars. Ling, Bennett, XQ, Fischl, Chevreuse, all characters are very common in her teams, and you can flex them around in so many different variants of her teams, and in some cases, you can also use 5-stars to replace them. So if you want to use XQ on one side of your team, or for one scenario, you can use Yolan for the other. You want to use Fischl for this one team, but you need him for the other side, you can use Yaimiko instead. And Bennett is a bit of a hard one to replace. Right now there's not really a good replacement for Bennett in many teams, which is why so many people consider Bennett an S tier unit. But even then, there is plenty of Raiden variants here that don't rely on Bennett. Whether that be the double Hydro Core, using typically a Yolan, Farina, and some form of Animo as healing like Jin or Jin Yun, or you can go for a aggravating goal where you're using Dendro units like typically Nahida, but there's nothing stopping you from using a Yao Yao or a Baiju or someone instead, and then leaning more towards aggravate and reaction damage and pulling back on your attack scaling. Or even in the Chevreuse variants, you're getting attack from Chevreuse, which puts some diminishing returns on how valuable that attack would be from Bennett, allowing you to get away without needing Bennett in every variant of these teams. Well, it is worth mentioning, Bennett is very strong in Raiden teams. She is an attack scaler, so inherently she's always going to be very biased towards Bennett, as every attack scaler in the game is, frankly. But there's one variety of Raiden team that I've explicitly ignored up to this point in the video, because it almost feels sacrilegious talking about Raiden's way and playing her this way, which is entirely ignoring her burst and just playing for her solely for her skill. This variant of her teams feels wrong, because Raiden is this very flashy character people enjoy, and this variant of her teams, she serves one purpose. You swap in, you press E, and then you don't touch her again until you're between rotations or for another 30 seconds when its duration ends. There's one specific archetype of team that wants to take advantage of this interaction in Raiden's kit, which is Hyperbloom teams. Because Hyperbloom teams really only care about two things: spawning as much Dendro cores as possible through some combination of Hydro and Dendro units, and having someone who has the ability to apply Electro to those cores and stack as much EM as humanly possible. And conveniently for Raiden, the AoE on the coordinated attack spawn from her skill has a large enough AoE that in almost every enemy in the game, when you hit an enemy with any form of damage, you will trigger that coordinated attack, and the AoE is big on it that it will typically detonate the Hyperbloom core. allowing you to do massive dendro damage with no interaction from Raiden really, except for a quick little pop in and E once every 30 seconds. It is worth mentioning that when you're running this build, you're going to need to re-yo your Raiden every time you switch between these two teams, because if you're running this version of Raiden on a crit build, your damage would be insanely disappointing. But if you don't mind swapping builds, you can use this build using very simple artifacts. Ideally, you'd be running 3 EM main stats on the flop set, but if you're not willing to go farm that domain, just run 3 EM's main stats with as much EM as possible on your Feather and Flower, try to get a 2-piece set or a 4-piece gilded, and then just run a Dragon's Bane. Your refinement of Dragon's Bane doesn't matter. All that matters is the Dragon's Bane is 90 for the max EM bonus, and you're done. No special farming. You can get all this from Strongbox because almost no investment into like an actual domain, and it's very easy to build. You don't even need talent levels leveled. All you need is the Raiden to be 90. You can have level 1 talents and everything, and this build still functions. There's really only 2 other applications for this variant of Raiden builds. These 2 types are pretty uncommon, but I will lay them out anyways just to put the information out there, which is the first and probably the more common of the 2 is to use her as a Electro Applier for a Chevreuse team. I mentioned earlier how you can run her in Chevreuse teams, but those were mentioned with you running Raiden as the main driver, where Chevreuse as a character is trying to buff your Raiden so your Raiden can do more damage. In this variant, you're building Raiden full EM preferably. You're pressing skill and you're swapping out, and this is to enable the overload reaction to trigger Chevreuse's passives to provide all the buffs she provides. And this is typically only be done if you're running some form of pyro carry, whether that be like Arlecchino, Hu Tao, Shayling, Yumiya, Diluc, whoever it may be. You can run this with them to trigger the overloads, and then you can use Chevreuse Bennett to stack as much attack buffing as possible. Fischl and like other characters like Guy will generally be better DPS, but Raiden requires so little field time, as well as she's just so easy to play due to the AoE and how her coordinated attacks work, that there is scenarios where that would be a more comfy variant as a team for some people who are looking for it. The other variant, and this is probably even more niche than that, is you can use her with Niviolette to trigger his passive, where you need to trigger unique types of Hydro reactions to get him more scaling on his charge attacks. You can run Raiden in that same team. Typically, people run Raiden in that same team with them alongside a Nahida to trigger Hyper Blooms, but I don't really consider that a Hyper Bloom team because you're not actually trying to build around Hyper Bloom there, so I still want to mention it separately. I'm going to keep the build section very brief. When it comes to your EM build, you're just going to slap as much EM substats as you can find while being level 90. When it comes to a driver build, you're going to be trying to maintain a good crit ratio, preferably having about 2 times your crit damage as you have crit rate, while managing to have around 200 ER or more. If you have anywhere up to 250, you're not really wasting ER because you can always use more on her thanks to her passive, allowing you to convert some of your ER into damage percent, but try not to overshoot it by too much. You're going to be using the Emblemless Ever Fate set in almost every occasion, while trying to use the catch as your go-to 4-star weapon. If you have 5-star weapons lying around, Engulfing Lightning is your preferred, but most 5 stars stat sticks as a crit sub on them will typically be a good option that's comparable or better than the catch. If you are lacking the catch or a 5-star weapon, you can always use the Favonius Lance or Deathmatch if you buy the Battle Pass. Even 3 years after my original pulling of Raiden on her first banner, I still find myself playing her regularly to this day. She's definitely not this super powerhouse meta unit that's the top of the game, but she is still a versatile unit that sees play all the time, and I think is really comfortable to use in many different forms of content in the game. And as MiHoYo continues to release strong off-field supports that typically require some form of ER, characters like Raiden allow her to battery from on-field, make her such a comfortable new unit to test out these new powerful supports we get with regions, most notably from Fontaine, we had Farina, and many units like her inevitable to come in the future. And as long as MiHoYo keeps releasing units like that, I think Raiden still has a fair place in the game as just a useful, easy to use comfort driver that many accounts can find use on and continue using in the future. I find it relatively unlikely that we're going to end up regretting her in the near future as characters are going to come out with Natlan. Thank you to anyone who made it this far in the video. I plan to have another video out about this time next week, going over the dev stream that I suspect we're going to be announced for this Friday, going over any changes and stuff we'll see in 5.1 that could be interesting. I'd really appreciate some comments or criticism down below because I'm working at this video by video and I'm hoping to do better next time, so a little bit of criticism or feedback would really help. Have a great day, everyone, and bye-bye.